At 87 years old, Wanda Jackson is finally breaking her silence, not just about her career, but about something she's carried for over 6 decades. In a quiet, unfiltered moment, she looked straight into the camera and said, "There's something about Elvis I've never told anyone. Not my husband, not my label, not even my band." And just like that, the room froze. For decades, Wanda has been painted as the fiery Queen of Rockabilly, the woman who lit up stages in fringe and fire. But behind the glitter and guitar licks was a secret, one that began on tour with Elvis Presley and has haunted her ever since. Some say it was a romantic secret. Others say it was something deeper, something involving a contract, a promise, and a night no one will talk about. Until now, Wanda Jackson isn't asking for permission anymore. She's here to set the record straight. And when you hear what she's held on to all these years, you'll understand and why they wanted her quiet. Wanda Jackson wasn't born into fame. She built it with grit, defiance, and a voice no one could tame. Born in 1937 in Maud, Oklahoma, she was raised by a father who believed girls deserved guitars just as much as boys. That gift, a second-hand instrument with chipped paint and frayed strings, became Wanda's first weapon in a long war against what Nashville expected women to be. By age 14, she was singing on local radio. By 16, she had landed her first recording contract. But it wasn't until 1955, when she met Elvis Presley, that everything changed. Elvis was 20, loud, unpredictable, and fascinated by Wanda. They shared stages during the early days of rockabilly's rise, performing in dusty auditoriums and beer-soaked honky-tonks. Wanda, still a teenager, watched the way he commanded rooms, bent genres, and ignored the rules. He told her flat out, "Don't let them turn you into something you're not. You've got something different. Use it." It wasn't just advice, it was permission. That summer, everything shifted. Wanda started experimenting, pushing her country roots through distorted guitars, hiccuped vocal licks, and unfiltered lyrics that no woman dared to sing at the time. With songs like "Let's Have a Party" and "Mean, Mean Man," she wasn't asking for approval, she was kicking the door in. But the industry wasn't ready. Executives called her sound dangerous, her clothes too revealing, and her lyrics inappropriate. They pushed ballads on her, told her to smile more. One producer even demanded she wear longer dresses if she wanted radio play. Wanda refused. She dressed louder, sang harder, took the stage in heels and fringe, and stared down every doubter in the crowd. But with every hit, every charting single, came more resistance behind the curtain. Her name was left out of tours she was promised. Her royalties came late, or not at all. And when she pushed back, the message was clear. You can sing loud, but not for long. And yet, through it all, she kept her silence about one thing: Elvis. Not just the friendship, not just the romance, but a moment, she says, defined everything that followed. A night backstage, a conversation that still replays in her head every time someone asks her what really happened between them. She's only hinted at it over the years, and now, after decades of holding her tongue, she's finally ready to reveal what he told her and why she never told anyone else. As the 1960s began, Wanda Jackson should have been untouchable. She had already broken barriers no other woman had dared cross, touring with all-male rockabilly acts, charting hits in both country and pop, and doing it all while refusing to be anyone but herself. But instead of celebrating her, the industry began pushing her out quietly, systematically. It started with radio. Stations that once played her edgy, rebellious tracks stopped returning call. DJs who'd once cheered her on began spinning softer, newer voices. Labels told her to abandon rockabilly and return to more traditional country. But when she submitted a new set of songs with that very sound, the response was even colder. It's good, but we're looking for something a little more polished, more submissive. She knew what that meant. She wasn't young enough, quiet enough, or easy enough to control, and she had never played that game. Wanda was boxed into a corner. Offers disappeared. Tours were canceled. And more disturbingly, her name began vanishing from the historical narrative altogether. Articles about early rock and roll left her out. Documentaries skipped past her entirely. When award shows honored the pioneers of country music, she wasn't on the guest list. Meanwhile, men she had once mentored were being elevated to icons. She once asked a label executive why she wasn't included in a major tour celebrating the first generation of country innovators. He smiled and said, "We didn't think you'd want to be in the background." But it wasn't just her career they were erasing. It was her voice. Songs she'd written were recredited. Old recordings were edited, remastered, and reissued under different names. One of her early singles was even re-released in a European market without her name attached, just listed as unknown female vocalist. Wanda kept working. She toured small club, county fair, even churches, but the stage lights dimmed. The press stopped calling, and still, she kept her silence about Elvis. She never said what he had told her that final night backstage in 1956. Never told anyone about the handwritten note he had slipped into her guitar case before they parted ways for the last time. All she's ever said, until recently, was that he knew what was coming, and he didn't want to be part of it. Now, decades later, Wanda has finally decided it's time to talk about that note, because, as she says with a long pause and a half-smile, it wasn't just about him, it was about all of us, and what they planned to do once they didn't need us anymore. By the early 1970s, Wanda Jackson found herself standing on the edge of two worlds, one that had left her behind and another that hadn't yet figured out what to do with her. The radio had moved on. Nashville had buried her under a pile of newer, more obedient voices. And yet, Wanda's name still echoed in small towns, in jukeboxes, in hearts. She was no longer the face of a movement, but to many, she was still its soul. It was then, out of both frustration and faith, that she made a choice few understood at the time. She turned to gospel. On the surface, it was a spiritual awakening, but beneath that, it was also survival. If country wouldn't let her speak her truth, then she would find a place that would. Gospel audiences embraced her rawness. They didn't care that she'd once shaken her hips in glittering fringe. They saw her as someone honest, someone who had lived pain and was now singing her way out of it. But make no mistake, this wasn't a retreat. Wanda's gospel era was laced with fire. She sang with the same defiance, the same thunder, just pointed heavenward. And during this time, something shifted. Away from the glitz and glare of the industry, Wanda began to reflect, not just on her career, but on the patterns. How many women like her had been pushed out? How many voices had been softened, erased, or sacrificed for market trends? She began keeping records, contracts, letters, press clipping, pieces of a puzzle no one else seemed willing to put together. She noticed discrepancies in her royalties, odd clauses in old publishing deals, entire tracks she remembered recording that had somehow vanished from all archives. And through it all, the Elvis memory kept tugging at her. That night in 1956, after a show in Shreveport, he'd pulled her aside backstage. He looked tired, older than his years. He said, "They don't want you to last, Wanda. They just want to say they discovered you. After that, they'll move on." He gave her a folded piece of paper and told her not to read it until she got home. For years, Wanda kept that note tucked inside a family Bible. She never told anyone about it. Not her husband, not her children, not her band. She's finally opened it again. And what Elvis wrote wasn't just a warning. It was a map, a list of names, of companies, of radio stations. Wanda never understood it fully at the time, but now, at 87, with the clarity of hindsight, she sees it for what it was. Elvis had seen behind the curtain, and he wanted her to know where the strings were being pulled. For decades, Wanda Jackson carried that note like a splinter in her soul. Quiet, buried, but never gone. She never spoke publicly about what Elvis wrote, not because she feared backlash, but because she wasn't sure people would believe her. Even now, at 87, her hands tremble slightly when she pulls it from a sealed envelope, a yellowed piece of lined paper with Elvis's unmistakable handwriting. The ink has faded, but the message is still clear. At the top, in bold letters, "Watch these names." Beneath it, a list. 10 names. Some of them executive, some producers. Others she didn't recognize, at least not back then. Wanda says she only understood their roles much later, as patterns emerged. Several were later tied to allegations of artist exploitation. One was quietly removed from a major label after whistleblowers exposed him for siphoning royalties through fake publishing firms. Another went on to run a powerful talent agency that, according to Wanda, could blackball an artist with one phone call. Elvis had told her, "They're going to use us up. They don't care about the music. They care about the machine." It wasn't paranoia. It was prophecy. Wanda began quietly researching the names. Over the years, she saw the same fingerprints on dozens of artist contracts, clause manipulations, misreported royalties, buried masters. She even discovered her own recordings, licensed in Europe without her knowledge, credited to unknown female rockabilly vocalist. Her attempts to investigate were met with dead ends. Lawyers vanished, labels changed hands, paper trails disappeared, and then there were the calls. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, whenever Wanda spoke publicly about being mistreated by the industry, someone would call her home late at night. No voice, no breathing, just silence. Once, during a live radio interview where she mentioned bad deals from the past, the station's phone lines went dead mid-broadcast. The engineers never found a technical issue. Wanda began to wonder how many others had gotten a note like hers. She once asked Johnny Cash, years later, during a quiet conversation backstage at the Opry, if he had ever felt watched. He looked at her, nodded slowly, and said, "All the time. They're always watching, especially the loud ones." That moment stuck with her, because Wanda wasn't just loud, she was unforgettable. And now she was finally ready to be heard, for real and without permission. By the time Wanda Jackson entered her 80s, most expected her to fade quietly into the sunset, a legend politely honored at awards shows, wheeled out for lifetime achievement tributes, then tucked back behind velvet curtains. But Wanda had no interest in playing the polite elder stateswoman. She had lived too much, lost too much, been silenced too many times, and when she finally chose to speak, she didn't whisper, she thundered. In 2019, just before her official retirement, Wanda sat down for a closed-door conversation with a group of young female country artists. The goal was mentorship. What it became was something much heavier. One by one, the women shared their frustrations, royalty delays, radio gatekeeping, predatory contracts. Wanda sat silently for most of it, nodding, letting them speak. And then she pulled out a worn leather binder. Inside were copies of old contracts, royalty statements, personal letters from producers and executives, documents she'd collected over 6 decades, many of which had never seen the light of day. She showed the women side-by-side statements, proving her earnings had been altered, handwritten edits in the margins of her agreements that stripped her of creative control, even a memo from a 1970 board meeting where her name was listed under a category labeled Discontinue Promotion. She laid them all out and said simply, "They didn't just do it to me, they do it to all of us. I just kept the proof." After that meeting, whispers began swirling through the industry that Wanda had files, that she was naming names, that she was finally ready to publish her story, and that it wouldn't be soft. Around that same time, a Nashville publisher reached out to propose a memoir deal. Everything was moving forward until a week before signing, when the offer was suddenly pulled. The reason given? Creative disagreements. Wanda later revealed they asked her to remove all references to Elvis's note and the executive names he'd warned her about. She refused. Since then, multiple attempts to tell her full story have quietly stalled. Interviews rescheduled, editors reassigned, and still, Wanda persists, releasing pieces, speaking to smaller outlets, and sharing just enough to keep the pressure building. She says she's saving the rest for one final release, something definitive, and she's made it clear. When that story drops, a lot of people are going to pretend they never knew me. That's how I'll know it's honest. Wanda Jackson isn't just trying to reclaim her legacy. She's trying to blow the dust off the entire machine. Wanda Jackson's journey through country music wasn't just one of talent and trailblazing. It was a quiet war, and somewhere deep in that war, hidden beneath the rhinestones and radio jingles, lies a truth she never expected to carry alone. Because for all the applause she received in public, there were just as many threats made in private. And the deeper she dug into her past, the more she realized she hadn't simply been forgotten by country music. She had been erased. In 2021, a small archival company in Austin, Texas, contacted Wanda's team. They had recently acquired an abandoned storage unit once owned by a former music executive. Inside, they found hundreds of demo reels, contract copies, and industry memos from the 1960s and 70s, many with Wanda's name on them. Among the files was a scratched vinyl acetate labeled simply WJ, Private, Do Not Release. When Wanda heard it, her hands trembled. It was a forgotten demo, one she had recorded in 1964, a raw ballad called I'll Sing It Anyway. The song was about silencing, about men who rewrite stories, about fighting for a voice in a world that wanted her quiet. Wanda had recorded it in one take, angry and inspired, but the label had shelved it immediately, and now, nearly 60 years later, it had resurfaced. The archivist who uncovered the track claimed that several other acetates with Wanda's initials were missing from the same collection, records someone had clearly removed before the sale. And when he tried to release I'll Sing It Anyway online, he received a takedown notice within hours. The sender? A legal firm tied to a now-defunct Nashville publishing company. Wanda had seen this before. Silence disguised as legality. Erasure covered in fine print. But this time, she wasn't backing down. She began drafting a statement. Not to the press, not to the labels, but to her fans. She wanted them to know that the songs they never heard weren't lost. They were hidden, that the woman they thought had stepped away was actually pushed, and that Elvis's warning all those years ago wasn't about a moment. It was about a movement, a system. In her own words, they didn't just bury my records. They buried my story, but I've kept the shovel. And now, the truth is clawing its way back to the surface. In the spring of 2023, Wanda Jackson sat down in her Oklahoma home for what she quietly called her exit session. There were no managers, no makeup artists, no lighting crews, just her, a single camera, and a microphone. What began as a modest video meant for her grandchildren quickly evolved into something far bigger, an unfiltered, emotional unpacking of everything she had kept locked away for nearly 70 years. She spoke for over 3 hours. She started with the usual: her first guitar, her teenage shows, the thrill of opening for Elvis. But then her voice changed. She leaned in close to the lens and said, "I've told parts of my story, but I've never told it all, not until now." And she did. She described secret meetings where producers demanded she soften her image. She revealed the night her radio play was pulled because she refused to sign over her publishing rights. She confessed to being followed for weeks after declining a label's final contract offer. She even shared the name of the executive who offered her a blank check to walk away quietly in 1971. Then came the Elvis note. She held it up to the camera, creased, faded, unmistakably real. Wanda read it out loud for the first time, the full version. "If you fight them, they'll freeze you out. If you beat them, they'll pretend you never existed. But if you outlast them, they'll come crawling. Don't sign their silence. Don't sell your sound." She paused. Then she said something that has since haunted everyone who's seen the footage. "I was 19 when he gave me that. I didn't know how true it would be. I've watched it happen to every woman who dared to fight. And now I see it happening again. Different names, same game." She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She spoke like a woman who had been waiting her entire life for the moment when someone, anyone, would finally listen. That video was never released to the public. Only a few trusted friends and family members have seen it, but copies exist. And Wanda's made sure it's included in her final wishes, because when her voice eventually goes quiet, she wants that recording to speak in her place. And in it, she doesn't just share her pain. She names the machine that built her, broke her, and then tried to pretend she never happened. Wanda Jackson didn't wait for permission. She carved her name into the side of an industry that was never built for her, wearing fringe and fire-like armor. She kicked open doors, sang louder than she was allowed to, and paid for every single note with silence, erasure, and years of being overlooked. But at 87, as she finally lifts the veil, it becomes clear she didn't just make music, she made history, and now she's rewriting it. The industry will remember her hits, her dresses, her wild energy. They'll post tributes, release commemorative box sets, and praise her as a pioneer. But what they won't admit is this: they spent decades trying to break her spirit, to erase her from the timeline, to strip her of her truth, and package her into something safe, soft, and marketable. But Wanda Jackson was never soft, and now she's not silent either. Her story is more than glitter and grit. It's a blueprint, a cautionary tale, a warning to the next generation of artists, especially women, who dare to speak too loudly, write too boldly, or refuse to be controlled. She kept the receipts, the letters, the contracts, the note from Elvis. She kept the heartbreak, too, the kind the music industry doesn't write songs about, the kind they bury with gold records and edited documentaries. And still, she stands. Maybe that's the greatest revenge of all. Not a comeback tour, not a flashy biopic, but survival. Outlasting the very system that tried to silence her, outliving the men who laughed in her face, and speaking, finally, in a voice stronger than ever. Wanda once said, "They tried to write me out of the story, so I started writing my own." Now, with time running thin, and the spotlight finally hers again, she's not asking for applause. She's not even asking for credit. She's giving the world her truth, unfiltered, unedited, and undeniable. And when that truth finally hits the airwaves, the sound won't be country, it'll be justice.